a paradise lost. So I won't take you back to many, many, many thousands of years ago. I won't even take you back to a couple of thousands of years ago. But rather, I'll take you back, say, many years ago, when the world that once was a long time ago is clearly no longer. Because at this time, man had made much of the world as far as industrialization went. So there were many, many factories all over the place for purposes of providing jobs, as well as to ensure that the owners would become successful and wealthy at those. So industrialization was widespread and rampant all over the place. And that was a way in which to provide careers for a great variety of persons. And there were those that were making okay amounts of money, and there were those that were still scraping to get by at it. But there were those that made a whole lot of money. Like, for instance, you can get hired in at the entry level of a job, and you'll start off at the bottom. Then if you work there long enough, you'll get raises gradually and start to make more money. And then if you were really there a long time, you might get promoted to something like a supervisor, where you would make a lot more money, or through the course of getting raises, you will eventually start making a nice amount on your job. So things would go on everywhere, all over that way, where people would work in order to support themselves and their families. And nothing was free anymore, or there were very few things that were free. So that was an indicator. If you wanted to eat, you had to work in order to buy the food and purchase it. Unless you got a permit and went and fished and caught your own food, or if you dug a well in your backyard and tapped into some spring, then you could get your own water that way. But that wasn't the case with many people. So you had to work to eat, to drink, to provide comfort for yourself and your family, as well as shelter. And that wasn't necessarily a bad thing, but that's how it was. And that was an indicator that the world was no longer a free paradise for everyone. And aside from that, there were perspective viewpoints which would deem certain races inferior as compared to others. And that would be during the civil rights movement. And if you go back a little further, I could touch on the Holocaust crisis, which saw the extermination of many, many millions. And I can go even further back. It saw the enslavement of a Hebrew race, and which was associated with the racist perspective viewpoint. So let's get back to the modern time, the more modern time, but many years ago, during a time where people were being made to feel uncomfortable, and they were certainly being made to feel like they didn't belong in certain places due to their skin color as well as ethnic. And that was another indication that they were not in paradise. And the ones that were making them feel bad for being of a particular skin tone weren't necessarily happy either, because they had it just as bad as anyone else. They had to work, struggle, provide for their families, and they were susceptible to catching the same ails and woes as anyone else. So at that time, we saw good and bad, but you would call it a mixture of both. And that was a indicator in which good and bad coincided with one another. And many attributed that to the coin emphasis of two sides being that of heads and tails. So at this more modern time, during the height of civilization, during that period, many wise people who could discern would definitely and most certainly realize that paradise had been lost. Thanks for tuning in.